Check, check, check.
Hello. Okay. Can you tilt myself? Are you?
Nope.
Do we just both speak to the camera?
I think either one. Just whatever's comfortable. I do both. So, this is Eliza Greenman, a blogger, fruit explorer, experimental orchardist, farmer, entrepreneur. That's kind of a bad word.
It's okay.
Etc. And she was in California for a big tree planting job and had the time to stop by, so we've been hanging out for a couple of days, talking shop and making apple pie and
eating apple butter.
Yeah, testing apple butters.
Eating apples.
That's been cool. So we're just going to chat here for a bit about who knows what. Mostly I want this to be about you and your projects so that my audience is keyed into what you're doing and you have a chance to explain your overarching evil master plans and philosophies and projects and stuff. In a nutshell, like the elevator pitch of your kind of Hogtree project. How would you summarize that and explain to people who just are not already in that mindset?
Yeah. So, turn of the 20th century, so, rounding the corner from the 1800s into the 1900s, we had like 16,000 apple cultivars. And today, that might be down to 6,000 or 7,000. And a lot of the reason for that, as I was digging in, oh man, this might be a long-winded elevator pitch.
That's okay.
Around I think it was in 1910, there was this sort of lobbyist group of, the president was in it, there were lawyers and bankers and merchants and railroad tycoons that all got together, and they were basically like, we need to combine all of our forces to make some money. And at that time, westward expansion was happening because of the railroads,
right?
Where they were sending all these people out west and saying, hey, this is the newest, the USDA was plant exploring for wheats, more hardy wheats at the time. And I believe they were also plant exploring for hardier soy cultivars to be grown. And so at that time, they were really pushing these new westward expansionists out there. And in return, they'd grow the wheats, they'd grow the soy, they'd put them on the train would come back, the merchants would be able to, get their fix and all this. That was pretty much the really first charge in streamlining the cultivars that were available, because that was the rise of the cooperative extension.
And wasn't that movement also couched in terms of profits for farmers and moving toward efficiency and away from diversified small holdings? So they're pushing the idea. I know there was a big argument pushing the idea that small diverse farms who grew their own produce plus a variety of other crops to sell were basically obsolete, and that it was inefficient and it didn't fit into the new paradigm. Is that kind of your
because it all had to fit all these apples had to fit into apple-sized holes, on the merchant side, and so the rise of the cooperative extension happened, and that eliminated biodiversity. That was a really big blow to all these people who were growing seedling apples,
right?
Because that was one of the first times where they really defined what apples would be bought. And so you see apples that were Ben Davis was still around, still a thing, and that's because it can ship like no other. They were shipping barrels of Ben Davis over to Europe, that looked fresh as a daisy when they arrived.
Which is just crazy to me. It's like selling, ice to Eskimos or something.
Exactly.
Selling apples to England, but they did it. So.
Yeah, and it is nuts. I haven't thought about that, but. So we basically took our 17,000 apple cultivars, and the extension agents were just I can't tell you how to grow these other ones, but I can tell you how to grow these. And they happen to be heavy spur bearers, long keepers, lower in vigor, more controllable, and also beauty. So Hawkeye Delicious
Definitely,
was chosen. And that's a Midwestern originated apple. So
just to interject for a second here, that was also the start of the rise of this stupid expert culture that we have now, where it's like you go to this authority and they're supposed to know everything that's right for your region, and so you're just getting this like de-diversification and institutionalization of information, which is then passed on to the next expert and passed on to the next expert, and it just kind of dumbs everything down.
Right. You absolutely, you lose this any semblance of traditional like ecological knowledge.
Right, and
well.
Also dynamic things where like the farmers are making decisions and talking to each other more, and like using these periodicals more than anything else as sounding boards for each other and what does well. Like farmers doing the work themselves. They're collecting hundreds of cultivars. They're testing them out. They have these meetings once a year. They write into the periodicals and like, this year in New York, this froze to death. This froze to death. This got fire blight. This survived. This ships, and all that stuff. Right.
Rather than pooling everybody for the best of the best, it just became, this is all we're going to sell.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that defined the market. That defined what apples were grown for.
What I noticed is it also narrows the chance that those people will take. Like we were talking earlier this week about the small apples and how I've been saying forever that they're marketable, which we're starting to see. I know 2 apples that are on the market that are popular, including the little rocket one. But that's like the biggest chance they seem to take. I mean, and that apple isn't even interesting. It doesn't have the qualities that I think that people should grow small, crab-derived apples from. It's just a miniaturized version of a boring apple.
Right. It was just all going wrong.
Yeah, and also part of that too, though, is that I saw this also happening early reading those periodicals where those more diverse farmers themselves were starting to move in that direction. So I don't think it was a hard sell, because they're all saying, you see all the time where they're like, well, these are my favorite eating apples, but these are the apples that you should grow for the market because they ship better, they sell better, they look better. These people like expect this apple or something like that. So I think there was probably a perfect storm for all of this to happen, to look at the big picture.
Yeah, completely overthrow.
Yeah.
So, but in the meantime, like I learned this, but before I learned about this sort of takeover of the culture of apples, I was doing a lot. I was working in Maine. I had a lot of apples at my grasp, like hundreds of cultivars, and I was really into these apples called sweets, and sweets often have very little acidity, and when you eat them, it almost gives like a banana flavor, just because our taste buds aren't really accustomed to no acid foods other than like banana, that grow in our landscape.
Most of them are yellow too, right?
No, a lot of them are red. Like Victoria Sweet is like a deeper red with giant lenticels. They kind of run the gamut.
Okay.
And
they also do have especially high sugar too, right? It's not just the low acid?
No, they're kind of middle of the road.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's just like, and then this is a little bit of an aside, but like acidity really does affect our perceived notion of sugar.
Oh yeah.
It brings it up.
Absolutely, yeah.
Brings an apple way sweeter.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, yeah. And I was reading that, this traditional heritage pig breed called a mulefoot, at least in New England, they finish these pigs in the fall on sweet apples, and basically like 2 months of different sweet apples, and they would name them like Tolman Sweet, Ramsdale Sweet, Victoria Sweet. And also in the 1800s, the sweet apples were used for molasses, mostly because like if you concentrate an apple juice down far enough, if you have acidity, that's going to really become crazy. And so low acid apples were, the sugar substitute of New England outside of maple syrup. It was just a different season.
Right, and like I was saying to you, when I did my research on traditional apple butter from that, from the 1800s, the only apples I found mentioned as specific, I'm sure they used a lot of everything, but the only ones that were really specific were all sweet, had sweet or sweeting in the name.
Yeah, so people were making apple butter and apple molasses, but they were also finishing their hogs on this sweet apple. And that kind of like lit a light bulb of like, okay, this apple is probably doomed outside of like some cherished heirloom collections that are going to be lost at some point soon, because they have no market value today. Like all these practical uses of these apples are gone. And so, but feeding livestock, offsetting your feed cost with with apples, in order to have like a value added, like sweeter fat on your pigs, like that just makes so much sense. It costs no money other than to plant the tree.
And you also want fat, like a lot of people don't anymore. So that's another different paradigm shift where like traditionally pigs were grown as much or more for the fat than anything, because what else do you use? Like how do you get your fat? If you can't grow olives, you can't do seed crops. I mean, that's impractical and it's hard to get the oil out. So either you're getting oil in your natural food or you're getting animal fat, and pigs are like fat producing machines. So part of that whole paradigm of raising pigs was just like how fat can we make this pig in a short amount of time.
A lard pig. And
right,
a lot
at
of
that
those...
time of year when you have whatever resources you had, which could have been the grain you grew over the summer, or the fruit, or the chestnuts, or the acorns that fell on the ground. In that paradigm, like you have to have that crop, whatever it is, you know, and apples make sense, especially because you can time them.
Exactly. And so that's where I got, you know, at the time when I was reading all about these sweets, I was managing this heirloom orchard in Maine that had like 120 cultivars or so. And it was a bear to manage because these trees were just no cultivars were really together in any way that made sense. And I didn't even think about that at the time, like that cultivars should be together in a way that makes sense, whether that's bloom time, if you're looking to manage them in that way, or for me, harvest time, because like when you have 120 apple varieties across 5 acres, and that's just 5 acres, you're running, it's a lot more work. And so I was seeing that, and I was like, never again do I, because it also costs a lot of money if you're hiring a crew to come in and harvest, and they're having to go from this corner to this next tree to this one to this one. It takes up way too much time. Whereas if they could just move tree to tree to tree, then you're saving, because it's efficiency. Efficiency is money and time. And so, I started to think about, all right, like in this orchard in Maine, I've got a late July apple, I've got a first week of August, a second week of August, and all the way up. And then, first week of September, I had like 8 cultivars. Second week, 9 new ones, and it just built. And so I started to think, like, not only is this a great concept for a U-pick, is to actually get your harvest times in order, because it's flow. It's flow of people, it's flow of workers, and it could also be flow of money, and
That's
also
important.
a flow of animals.
Right.
So like, if we treated, because this orchard I was managing was a U-pick, which was a disaster, but if, because it was everywhere, and so in order to direct people to the right trees, it took a lot more time and energy. And so, that's where this whole idea of a drop scheme sort of came alive in me.
Yeah, like that drop scheme. Hashtag drop scheme.
Yeah, and of putting these cultivars together in order to facilitate flow of humans or flow of animals or both. Because then, shortly after, I went to Kyrgyzstan because I was just like super upset with the management practices of like conventional management practices, and I had gotten poisoned by a fungicide I had to spray for this old man, and I was just like disenfranchised with just the status quo of horticulture. So I went to like the native home, one of the genetic native homelands of apples to just see like how are they growing. What's the deal? And what I found was they weren't like chaotic, untamed forests of fruits and nuts.
Really?
Instead, they were like these forests that had cultivated a relationship with humans over like 1,000 years. And livestock were a main managing part of this system, where, everything was intimately connected. Like, the trees were connected to the livestock, which were connected to the humans, and it all just worked very, very, very well. And so that's where It's like, you know what? I think livestock are meant to be integrated into orchards, or you know, wild plantings or whatever, something that's cultivated by humans but with a, you know, wilder kick. And so that was sort of how Hogtree was born. I took all my notes and put all the drop times together, and the goal is to feed livestock, to have animals finish up the harvest, but also to have efficient harvest for human products and such. And
not just meat, but whatever works, right?
Yeah, so I focus right now on cider, on hard cider. Yeah. So like,
that's a good match because the apples don't have to be as pretty for the, you know, the standard market. You don't have to sell people on your ugly apple thing, which is another thing we could maybe talk about if we have time.
Yeah, I'm really into ugly apples. But yes, it exactly, like I can have a means to, so like the way the trees are going right now is my first scaffold branches, like the lowest ones, are specifically for hogs, and so that's a whole drop scheme of like I live in Virginia, and so I'm in Zone 7A, and my first apples are like June 20th, and then I literally have apples every week and through December, you know, that hang January. Some crab apples, they're super fermented by the time they...
Yeah.
But
I'm pretty sure we can get you later than that, too.
Yeah. And that's just like thinking about having pigs clean up your orchard and have them be an integral part of it. Like, not only is their diet of apples like being recycled into the soil and taken up by the trees, but they're preventing a lot of diseases.
They're keeping the vegetation down.
Yeah.
They're aerating the soil, you think? Or are they compacting it? Depends.
I live in a wet climate, and I have to move them often in order to keep them from compacting.
So you consider that more of a problem than a solution?
Yeah.
Before I forget, in the wild apple forest, or not so wild maybe, did you think about or develop any theories about how the livestock were selecting for certain things because they would eat certain things and then poop them out, and obviously that's the perfect place to start an apple tree is in a cow pie or something? Yeah.
Right. So I did notice a trend in trees, like because it's the landscape kind of looks like maybe South Dakota or something there. You know, it's arid, it gets cold, it's got tall glacial mountains. I mean, South Dakota doesn't have like super tall glacial mountains, like 20,000 feet, but and so what I was noticing with the apples is they tended along the thoroughfares, you know, not when you get off the path, but along the beaten path, the apples all kind of had the same makeup. They were not nearly as intense in acidity. They were not nearly intense as in tannins. And so to me, and I know like it's a big part there to have like a shepherd's, you know, they'll just take their shepherd's crook with their sheep that they have and shake the apples down. And it seemed like perhaps that was a design, and you know, whatever dropped and whatever came up, you know, it kind of ended up being selected by sheep.
If there's enough livestock, there had to be some kind of effect that way, I would think.
Yeah, and in their ancient sort of story, they were saying that bears had a lot to do with the spread of it all throughout the Caucasus Mountains and things like that.
Yeah, I have no doubt that there's seedling apples from my seeds all over these hills from bears.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah. So I think there is a livestock selection. With cows, which I saw a lot in these forests, I don't know. I don't know if they were selecting for anything or not, but the interesting thing, I'll just explain this cycle real quick, is like, in Kyrgyzstan, they have walnut forests, and within these, and they're like...
Is it Carpathian?
Carpathian, yeah, because, I mean, that's what I meant for mountains, not Caucasus, Carpathian mountains. And so, like, but in these forests grow apples and hawthorn in the interior. Pears are a little bit higher.
Okay.
Pears are, and this is about a mile high. And then once you get above that, it kind of turns into a pure pear forest. But it's interesting because I love the interaction of the walnuts with the apples, because what's happening is these walnuts are putting off a chemical smell, juglone, that's automatically like a deterrent for insects to come in. But the insects that do end up getting in the apples drop, and these are kind of nomadic. These people are sort of nomadic in a way. Like, they don't just plant their animals in the forest all year round. It's cyclical. Like, you'll see a 4-year-old kid on a mini donkey taking the cattle way up into the mountains.
I think that's
kind of
more
thing.
of a traditional herding
Yeah.
style.
And so what happens is, this apple that gets an insect in it falls to the ground, and these cattle come around, and they'll eat that apple off the ground, and they're also eating the grass, and they're also eating any walnut pieces that have fallen, like leaves and such. So you're stopping your pest cycle right then. They're getting wormed naturally through eating walnut duff, and they're keeping the grass low, and then they move them out, and their main bread and butter is the walnut harvest, where people crazily get up in the trees and are shaking, and these are big trees, shaking like people die every year, and with the grass kept low, they have a walnut harvest. The people are having milk, they're having meat, all of this, and so they're getting walnuts, milk, and meat.
Fruit.
Trees are getting fertilized with all sorts of good cow manure and pee. And it's just like, it seems to be a cycle that works. With the concept of the food forest, the rise of the food forest, say in I don't know, I guess its popularity has peaked, but maybe 5 years ago or something. But that to me, is a completely unmanageable system unless you grid it out and lease out the grid to people to intimately get to know the species within their little grid mark, so that they know when to move their animals out and when to move their animals back in.
So you see a glitch in that paradigm as being a cultural issue.
Absolutely.
Essentially. So you have a large group of people that all have the same culture and the same agriculture and the same systems they've done, and they know what works. So yeah, that's kind of an evolutionary process, but you'd have to have people in there being part of the system.
So yeah, this all goes back to if we don't have a use for our fruits, they disappear. So that was sort of the birth of Hogtree. Also, I have to say, Hogtree also came out of a pretty severe depression, where I don't know about you, but I've talked to some other fruit people in my life, actually this year. And like one friend who has the genetic repository for elderberry. But
I thought you were going to say the genetic repository for depression.
Yeah. Well, and I was like, how did you get into this? And he's like, well, I got a divorce, and I had a really, really rough year, and I just got super depressed, and the only thing I could focus on were elderberry. And by the end of several months, I just ended up I read everything there was to read. I collected everything there was to collect, and it was something I could latch onto that brought me out of this depression. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, I could see a little bit of that. Yeah, when I was super geeked on apples was probably the hardest time, maybe the hardest time of my life, or close. Yeah. And it was okay, this is the thing. I feel like crap. I'm sick all the time. No energy, depressed about various, life things, relationships and stuff. And the thing that I always wanted to do is just stumble outside and go look at the trees, dick around with them, do apple research for hours and hours.
Exactly.
Interesting, yeah.
It was I don't know, the one thing I could focus on that would just cancel everything out, I guess, for the time being.
Yeah.
And I was intense in the research.
Yeah.
So yeah, now, and that sense has also been expanded. So in the months of May, for example, May and early June, when I don't have fruit, that's where I've really focused on mulberries. And then I mean, you could do drop schemes for all the fruits.
Yeah.
You know, like finish pigs on the traditional, and also, by the way, there were basically hog trees in the Southeast in the 1800s. After
Cool.
I found out that, like, and I was taken to an orchard, a remnant orchard of it, where in like North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, they were planting mulberries, ever-bearing mulberries with persimmons. And the ever-bearing mulberries in these pretty hot areas were producing from, like even in Louisiana, they would produce from mid-April to beginning of August. And then beginning of August through fall with a bunch of American persimmons.
Aren't they even later? Don't they hang on really well and just keep getting sweeter and falling off the tree?
Some do.
Some do.
Asian persimmons tend to have
Yeah.
more of the hanging gene.
Yeah, the timing thing's super intriguing, period. I mean, just for people, like I'm really into that because I can get July to February 1st here already, and I know I'm going to get longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get apples in June here. I think that's out of the question, but we can go way longer, and I think we'll have good apples hanging into March if people take up the challenge and start breeding in that direction.
That's right. So, yeah. I think the most relevant, this is my big push, is to scavenge, just search through the country, search through old papers right now. Like me and I'm half owner of this business called the Fruit Explorers, which is with Taylor Malone and myself. And we are in the business of trying to digitize everything we can find. So like books, old like organizations, membership organizations back in the 1800s,
Yeah,
1900s.
they're a gold mine.
Awesome. And they're just not available. Like if they just sit in an archive, they're not of any use to us. And like right now, we're at a really pivotal time where a lot of these old genetics, we're at the absolute maximum age for a lot of these old genetics. We have to find them or else they disappear.
Yeah.
And they are disappearing like at a rapid rate. And so that's where what we're really focusing on is trying to get access to knowledge and then going out and getting these cultivars and saving them and then putting them into these schemes that offset
now this I
feed
like.
stock,
Okay,
feed
so one of
cost.
my things is like it doesn't work to just have these repositories for genetics. Like the real heart and soul of apples or any food is like food culture. You know, so they need to have a purpose. And so like you're giving them a purpose where there's a reason to propagate them.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just, oh, let's save this because we might need it later. We'll put it in like a couple sites or maybe a couple, weirdo collectors have it. But to give it a purpose in life and a purpose in our culture, that's what's going to make stuff survive. And that's also what makes it relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Like a friend of mine that went to France, he's like, well, you can sit in a cafe and talk about cheese with someone for 2 hours, and it just burns time because this is like the culture. Mm-hmm. These things integrated into our local cultures. And that's the same thing. Like you're basically designing a agricultural system that could be replicable in, obviously adapting to sites. And that gives these old apples or the genetics, carried forward in breeding a purpose in life that they can actually have a reason to be propagated other than like, oh, let's save this for posterity's sake.
Mm-hmm. And their further uses can be discovered too.
Yeah.
And so it's so easy for me, it's so easy just to say, all right, at the bottom level, I'm cutting 50% of my feed costs for these livestock, or more. I mean, really the goal is all of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's doable in your climate. I think it's doable in my climate. In the upper Midwest and, the New England areas, like that's where it gets hard because your growing season's so short.
Right. Well, there's people in Canada growing apples, winter apples for cider that just hang on the tree.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of, you've got to remember it doesn't have to be useful to us to be useful to animals. You might have a bunch of drunk pigs, but...
Yeah, which is also fun.
Yeah, or not, depending on how drunk they are, right?
Yeah, they're a mean drunk, or if they're
a
a crying drunk. And like doing some research about the wild pigs in Chernobyl. That's absolutely, they were finding frozen on the tree apples, or apples that were encased in snow and ice.
There's probably a point at which it's better if it's colder, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
either you're going to have something like my climate where the apples can survive the coldest freezes. I mean, we don't get like a 5-gallon bucket isn't going to freeze solid here.
Yeah.
If that happened, we'd start to see freeze damage. But we get, you know, I'll pick, I have pictures of Pink Lady hanging on Frankentree here with ice in the stem wells. And that wasn't like the first night they had ice in the stem wells, and there's maybe like a little crack in the skin or something like that. But at some point, you're probably going to get to this point where, oh, you know, winter arrives like that, the apples freeze on the tree, and they just sit there with the whole sugars and no fermentation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or thinking about it as like a frozen, you know, fruit bank on the ground of, you know. But that's so out of my way of thinking. I try not to think about snow. I try not to think about super cold temperatures because it's not really my reality.
Right. But in transferring the system to other areas, that could be a benefit. You want to take care of that?
Ginger!
Your butt was right
Oh,
there.
you're right. There's the
Butt
cheeks. It's either mine or Ginger's.
Yeah, mine's getting pretty worked in there. It's like a tractor seat.
Right. It is.
I'm kind of interested in your take on the replicability of your concept.
Yeah, so in terms of like replicability, so far what I've been saying is there are benchmark apples, for example.
Okay.
So like you got to pick something that's grown almost in all the climates. So like, for instance, or is more so being grown, like yellow transparent is a benchmark apple. Like it's grown in New England, it's grown out west, it's grown in the South, you know. And so for me, like yellow transparent is a July 7th apple. And so, but for, you know, zone 5, where I used to live in Maine, it was the first week of August. And so that's like, you know, probably 4 weeks of difference. And really, there's not much change in between cultivars. You just adjust it 4 weeks up, basically.
Okay.
So everything that I have that's with, you know, yellow transparent, all in a line, like you just reset that 4 weeks, and then that's where you are in Maine, kind of thing. And so, of course, and that's where like the colder climate stuff gets a little bit harder because it's harder to find the earlier. The earliest apples I have are Swedish. And the reason for that is because there was this Swedish researcher, plant breeder named Nielsen Ehle. He was basically into like polyploidy and turning apples and all sorts of other grain crops into triploids from the regular diploid state. So that's like, diploid is 2 sets of chromosomes, triploid is 3, tetraploid is 4. So you gain a whole other basically set of genome, you know, and so he was doubling the genome. He was finding that the most cold hardy, like most bulletproof buds for a late frost were triploids. And he was also, and so he was able to select for really early bearing fruits, which is important in a cold climate like Sweden that doesn't get a whole lot of sun. And so, yeah, and those work in my climate too. They don't taste great. A June apple is not a delicacy.
I haven't had one yet, yeah.
A lot of times they're just like super acidic mush bags, you know.
Applesauce.
Yeah, you could do applesauce, but
pie and applesauce.
they're not fantastic, and that's why we don't see them anymore, but they could have a use one day.
Yeah, well, when people didn't can as much, it was more important because that first, like, it's not like people were just making applesauce, canning it, and then eating the rest of the year. It was like, oh, let's make applesauce for dinner.
Right. Right. And also in at least the Southeast, there was a kind of a gold rush at one point for like the earliest apples, you know, June producing apples, because those would get pumped up into like the New York markets.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, because we didn't have long-term storage necessarily.
People were tired of their dried apple pies or just no pie. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
just wrinkled, shriveled. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's genetics, like my business partner Taylor, he's found a June apple and a June pear that are amazing, you know, and they that June pair I think is second week of June in zone 6. So for me, it's bumping it down a week-ish. And his June apple is the same. I mean, so they're nothing to write home about, like, but at the same time, we got to preserve them because there's all sorts of amazing genetics in there.
Super valuable genetics.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it sounds like the transferable part, or the essence of your system and ideas is the conceptual stuff, and then the details are always going to change if you move sites. So just this idea that trees have this unique ability for timing, they leave the ground exposed to grow other stuff, and they produce stuff that we can use and that produces animal feed. You put just those ideas together and it's like, yeah, kind of a no-brainer to pursue that type of a thing. And pigs, of course, very omnivorous.
Chickens work for certain. So also this gets into the weeds a bit because
conceptually or literally?
Well, both, I guess. But like also you have to there is like a learning curve for this. Like you can't just park your pigs underneath apple trees and expect everything to thrive. Like one, they root. And even if you ring your pigs' noses so they don't root, there's issues with the amount of nitrogen that's coming out. I mean, pig urine is quite high in nitrogen, or in chicken poop. Like in my climate, I don't know how it would react in your climate, but in my climate, I'm in like the final frontier of apples, where every disease, we've got almost everything, and one of the big ones is fire blight, which is a bacterial disease. And it tends to prey on really
juicy, fast-growing
growth. Yeah, when something's growing super fast, the cells are elongated and those cell walls become thinner. So it's really easy to knock them, and then that whole branch dies. In a place with high vigor, high rainfall like I have, like heavy soils and a pretty decent rainfall.
Warm nights, warm days.
Yeah, you got to really watch what your inputs are, because we don't really need much. And so that for me sometimes is really having them in the alleys, like pigs in the alley rows of the trees. So like perhaps they're just on the drip lines, and then if there are fruit, it's a quick foray in there or something to that extent.
So do you use electric fences a lot?
I use a lot of electric
movable
fence.
net fences.
Mm-hmm. I use the hog fence. If I were doing chickens, I would probably, for chickens and like palm fruits, I would probably limit their activity under the trees to being pretty minimal. But like chickens and mulberries just can't, it's almost like they can't get enough. And especially your everbearings, where it's just every bit of new growth is producing fruit.
Oh, just as the season goes.
Yeah, it just doesn't. So like chickens in a mulberry situation is a very good thing.
Plus, you're growing more high protein leaf, just more and more and more.
So they're eating the mulberries. The mulberries are lapping up all that high nitrogen. It's putting on way more growth. You're probably extending your season. So yeah, it's all about like, I've had to do a lot of work on learning about livestock and like livestock dietary needs, but more so what comes out the back end and how that translates to management of my trees.
That's one of the things I remember reading a study on biochar with corn, is that it moderated the nitrogen, like in terms of burning plants. So there was an effect of where it would kind of absorb it and then release it slower. It wasn't just like blop on the roots, right? So it's like the charcoal gets it and then the roots get it, or the soil bacteria and the life kind of like, there's a buffering effect.
Yeah.
Essentially like that. And for a tree like mulberry that you're probably going to think about coppicing, you might coppice it all the time. Mm-hmm. You could be using that wood to produce char and just leaving it on the ground in like super simple methods where it's like you're going to do something with it. So create charcoal and just leave it on the ground. You just build it up really fast.
Yeah. So that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
We don't have really enough time to go into.
No, we definitely don't.
But like outside of char charcoal, I have done a lot of work on, like, watching, feeding pigs, methodically feeding pigs all sorts of just sticks that I freshly cut to see what they're eating, and like with willow, it's a medicine. I mean, can you imagine gaining, what is it, 1.5 pounds a day for like 7 straight months? Like, your body must hurt. And so, like, that's something that I think about all the time. And so I've been giving, like, I'll give the pigs willow, and I've watched them just take it and they just peel it right off and then slurp it like a piece of spaghetti, and like relish it, and then other times if I give it to them every day, they won't want it. But like Polonia is another one where they'll peel that off and eat it like, mulberry, same. So like there's that where they're eating like the cambium off of it, just leaving like the actual woody piece. And to me, like, that can either go in the way of mulch, or like, I'm really interested in, this is a whole other thing we won't talk about, but I'm really interested in trying to cultivate the right microorganisms in the soil to more speedily break that down. And I want it to be pretty quick, like, if we were to analog, like, there's a lot of people into like this syntropic agriculture with Ernst Gotch over in Brazil. It's timber, it's some sort of food crop, and it's like a lot of mulching crops and things. But in tropical areas, like, it breaks down quick.
Yeah.
And so everything's really cycling. And so for me, like, in a temperate climate, it's important to try and think about analogs just to get the breakdown happening at a faster pace than normal. And so, like, I'm selecting for leaves for species that have a higher nitrogen to carbon ratio in the leaf, that attract certain fungivores that stay there. I'm basically trying to make like a hotel for these fungivores that are going to run the scene of breaking down everything. But that's like that's going to be a long process. That's 10 episodes from now, and figuring out and like a whole other nerdery.
So you have your Hogtree thing, and you were telling me you have like a charcuterie business that plugs into that as like a business model.
Yeah.
Do you want to just talk about that real quick, and maybe even where people could sample your wares?
So I started keeping pigs, in this whole orchard concept isn't old for me. It dates back about 3 years now. So a lot of my trees aren't producing. A lot of what my pigs would get would be, trees in the. I live in an area where like where a famous horticulturalist lived, and there are grafted fruit and nut trees everywhere. And a lot of people know me, and I go in and harvest all their fruits, basically, and feed them to the pigs throughout the year, except for mulberries. They are getting mulberries at this point. So pork is my #1 crop because it's a young system. And so I'm sort of trying to manage this young orchard with pigs as an income. I tried selling whole hogs and half hogs, and that's fine. Like, those sold no problem, and people really loved them. But I really wanted to make a more concentrated product that I could ship, that was more shelf stable, that took up less freezer space.
Plus you have a lot of value added, so you're getting a lot more per pig. I mean, the worst case scenario is kind of selling the whole pig on the hoof, and the second's just selling a big chunk of meat.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so I got into charcuterie, where charcuterie is cured meat. And so, like, in the Southeast, charcuterie was basically like a country ham,
right? And
where they salt cured it, or they sugar cured it, and just got all the moisture out so it could hang forever. So I found some guys in my area. They're about an hour away, and they built like a USDA compliant facility for old world curing, essentially.
Wow.
So they're able to mold cure, like traditionally mold cure, which sounds terrible, I guess, to people who've never had it, but it's when, like, you have a salami or something that has a white powder on the outside. That's a traditional mold cure. that's completely healthy and
Right.
and everything.
And
But-
essentially inside the meat, that's a lactic ferment, isn't
Exactly.
it? Yeah, so it's similar to making sauerkraut out of meat.
Exactly. And so, yeah, that's what I started out with just one kind of salami, and that sold out. And so then I made a Spanish-style chorizo that was half beef, half pork, chorizo de Pamplona, and that sold out. And so this January, I decided, like, chips are in, and I sent 8 pigs completely to be broken down into charcuterie. And so this January, I'm doing sopressata, cacciatore, and an all-pork chorizo that are all going to be dry cured, you know, in the traditional salami form. Cured bacon, cured and smoked bacon, and that's with a walnut maple syrup. And what's native to me is this, it's called spice bush, Lindera benzone. And so spice bush berries and black walnut syrup and are all like curing, and then that's getting smoked over hican, which is a hickory. I'm just nerding out on tree crops because all these proceeds go to my you know, charcuterie just goes to support my work in this.
Yeah, that's how I am too. It's like,
and so, yeah.
Any income is just to support my geeked out projects to improve something.
Yeah, so the bacon's getting smoked over a hybrid of hickory and pecan. And yeah, this summer I got to get a little bit more meat to make the minimum batch, but we're going to do cured guanciale, which is jowls, and lomo, which is a dry cured loin. So January, yeah, is fresh sausage, those 3 types of salamis and chorizo, and the bacon, which I can ship anywhere. And I want it to just capture, I want to capture the flavors. I want to capture the tree crops in it. And they're ethical pigs. Like that's the other thing, is like almost all the other charcuterie you can buy are from CAFO pigs, you know, factory farm pigs that then have like this value added. There's not a lot of ethics I like involved in those pigs.
As you said, hashtag one bad day.
Yeah, one bad. My
and
pigs
the rest,
have one
the rest
bad
of their
day.
life is pretty awesome.
Right.
Maybe a little short, but
So yeah, hit up my website, hogtree.com. will be loaded with all that stuff once they come out, and I'll probably drop some. I got to update the site. Some.
Is your Apple blog still going?
Mm-hmm.
Eliza Apples, is it?
Eliza Apples, you could spell it. It's ELIZAPPLES. Yeah, and that's like crazy apple musings that are some mulberry in there, and I have like so many essays in draft form ready to go, but if you look, I haven't posted there in like 6 months because I just haven't been able to finish any of these essays. So
Yeah, that's how I found you, I think, doing some research or maybe seeing you on Instagram or something, and I was like, oh, this gal's like the same species as me.
yeah,
Pretty much, just overlapping but different interests, but the same, you know, kind of research, curiosity, a million different theories and all that stuff. So yeah, mining your brain further would be fun, but I know you have to drive north, and that was fun.
it was.
Cool.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was fun.
This has been really great, actually, to see all that you're up to. And
Instagram I'll put on the screen, and any other things that you use a lot.
not really. I'm pretty terrible at social media.
Yeah,
but
me too. I use Instagram more than anything, and I'd disappear for weeks at a time.
maybe funnel them over the NAFEX or something. The NAFEX group. It's one of the few groups I'm actually active in. And then once I'm not on the board anymore, I'm going to leave that. I'm not going to be active in it anymore. But
Oh, I didn't know you were on board.
yeah. Thank you, man. This has been really great.
Yeah, it was really fun. Do it again sometime.
Totally.
Start to dig deeper.
Yeah, there's so much.
That was the surface.
Just glancing.